Holders will send in forms giving the names and addresses of up to 3 charities to receive contributions. If a designated recipient is not obviously tax-exempt under Internal Revenue Service rules, Buffett's staff will ask for proof. What's obviously a charity to a widow in Winnetka might not be so obvious to Buffett. The staff will also have to verify the number of shares owned, make out the checks, and mail them, along with notes explaining that the gifts are being sent at the shareholder's request. Each shareholder must swear that the gift fulfills no other pledge he has made, or the IRS could treat the money as a dividend and increase Berkshire Hathaway's taxes accordingly. Despite these complications, Buffett says the paperwork shouldn't amount to much more than the minor storm of proxy votes for an annual meeting. If I'm wrong, he says, I'll be down here working Saturdays and Sundays. The contributions made in shareholders' names could reduce Berkshire Hathaway's net income by $1 million or more. Assuming a 46% tax rate, the effect of giving away $2 million is to cut after-tax profits by $1,080,000. But not all the charity money will be spoken for. Stock held in street names for customers by brokerage houses and other institutions can't be voted, and some individuals won't bother to vote or may prefer that the money not go to charity. Unallocated funds will be returned to corporate earnings. After sizing up the immediate reaction, Buffett estimates that many as 85% of the shareholders will respond. There's a lot of enthusiasm, he says. I know of one elderly woman who is very religious but doesn't have much income and can give only $5 a month to her church. She has quite a bit of our stock, so she'll now be able to give $60 or $70 a month. Buffett's plan is similar to, but less problematical than, a proposal by Robert A. Sproul, president of the University of Rochester, who has come up with a scheme by which a shareholder could send a gift to charity nearly double the size of his dividend at no additional cost to anyone, except the U.S. Treasury. The shareholder would tell the company that he would forego, say, his $100 third-quarter dividend if the company would send that amount, plus whatever income tax would have been paid on those earnings, to the American Red Cross, the University of Rochester, or some other charity. As Sproul reckons it, a corporation paying 46% of its earnings in taxes shouldn't care whether it sent $185 before taxes to charity or a $100 dividend to a shareholder and $85 to the government. Ingenious though it is, Sproul's plan is illegal. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan is trying to persuade Congress to legalize the plan, but he isn't likely to have much success, given current concern about the deficit. Corporations, moreover, seem lukewarm to the idea. AT&T, for one, is concerned that it might compete with a system under which its shareholders may automatically reinvest their dividends in stock. In 1980 alone, Ma Bell raised almost $1 billion through dividend reinvestment. Whether Buffett's plan will be imitated remains to be seen. Many corporations have far more shareholders than Berkshire Hathaway, but they also presumably have larger staffs to handle the paperwork. Several corporations to which Fortune explained the idea thought it imaginative, but had reservations. One contributions manager feared a shareholder backlash against giving corporate money to religious organizations, where much of Berkshire Hathaway's is almost certain to wind up under Buffett's plan. Churches receive over half of all contributions made by individuals. To avoid controversy, most corporations give only to secular organizations. In at least one significant sense, Berkshire Hathaway is an unusual company for which Buffett's plan is particularly appropriate. Buffett says it has no important corporate goals that could be advanced by directing $2 million to charities of the management's rather than the shareholders' choice. Other corporations do have such goals. Companies that hire engineers give money to engineering schools, hoping to stimulate research and attract graduates. Oil companies contribute to public television partly to persuade people in general and legislators in particular that they are responsible citizens and not simply collectors of obscene profits. Still, many companies might well follow Berkshire Hathaway's example, especially those with strong profits, few public relations problems, and a charitable impulse. Buffett has had good ideas about philanthropy before. Several years ago, he advised Grinnell College in Iowa to invest some of its endowment in a TV station, an unconventional choice for a school. Grinnell bought a station in Dayton for $12.9 million and sold it for $50 million 2 months ago. So when Buffett wanders off on his own, it makes sense to watch where he's going.
Berkshire Gives Up on Giving, August 11, 2003, by Nicholas Varcheva.
Warren Buffett has drawn criticism in the past for supporting pro-choice causes, but it never affected Berkshire Hathaway's charitable giving. That is, until Cindy Coughlin, a 34-year-old stay-at-home mom in Peoria, Arizona, came along. Now, as a result of her campaign against pro-choice donations, the most powerful man in business has terminated Berkshire's entire contribution program, which distributed nearly $200 million over the past 2 decades to institutions ranging from schools to groups on either side of the abortion debate. The unusual program, called it a charitable dividend, allowed Berkshire shareholders to designate $18 per share annually for up to 3 charities of their choosing. Some shareholders, including Buffett, via his foundation, use the mechanism to give to pro-choice causes such as Planned Parenthood. Fortune editor-at-large Carol Loomis is a director of the Buffett Foundation. The events were set in motion this winter by Coughlin, a mother of 3, who wanted to earn some money by selling for the Pampered Chef, a recent Berkshire acquisition with $740 million in revenues. Some 70,000 freelance consultants sell kitchenwares through Tupperware-style parties in people's homes. Coughlin says she was drawn to the Pampered Chef because she felt it shares her Christian pro-family values. The company's mission statement, for example, encourages people to develop their God-given talents. But Coughlin was dismayed to learn that Berkshire's purchase of the Pampered Chef meant that some portion of the profits she'd generate could fund pro-choice groups. She emailed a petition, which asked Berkshire and Buffett to end donations to such organizations to 100 friends and family in January. Pro-life organizations such as Life Decisions International began publicizing it. Pampered Chef chairman Doris Christopher initially told consultants in an April email that though my personal views on some issues differ from Warren Buffett's, it is not my place to ask or to judge. But her message didn't quell the furor. Consultants were resigning, says Coughlin, and customers complaining. Coughlin numbers the petitioners at less than 1,000. By late June, the pressure had become intolerable, and Christopher went to Warren with a heavy heart. According to an email she wrote to consultants, it troubled him deeply that charitable donations from Berkshire Hathaway were causing you difficulty. On July 3rd, Berkshire announced the end of the charity program. Before this year, Berkshire seemed impervious to such pressures. Pro-life activists had picketed its annual meetings and boycotted it for years. Last year, a shareholder resolution to cancel the charity program was soundly defeated, with 97% of shares voted against it. And Buffett defended the program in Berkshire's 2001 annual report, saying Berkshire makes no contributions except those designated by shareholders who are probably on both sides of the abortion issue in roughly the same proportion as the American population. So why did Berkshire abandon the program now? The company's announcement said that its ownership was now harming not only a subsidiary but also individuals. The board was willing to accept some damage from boycotts in the past because the cost was diffused across a giant corporation, but this was affecting pampered chef consultants who had nothing to do with Berkshire's policy. For her part, Coughlin is just delighted with the decision. But she says she won't be satisfied until the man she deferentially refers to as Mr. Buffett stops donating to pro-choice causes. Now, she says, the focus is on him.
Letters from Chairman Buffett, August 22, 1983, by Andrew Tobias. Buffett has written the chairman's letter in the Berkshire Hathaway annual report since 1966. But 10 years later, he served on a Securities and Exchange Commission panel studying how companies could improve their shareholder communications. And by the 1977 annual report, he was ready to renovate his own annual letter. The changes he made were gradual. By the early 1980s, though, his letters stood out for their intellectual content, humor, and individuality, and they began to attract wide attention. Fortune then determined to do a story, visualized as a kind of book review about the letters. I was not a logical candidate to be the writer because as the date drew near for the 1977 annual report, Buffett, then a friend of mine for around 10 years, asked me to weigh in with suggestions for his largely finished letter. My memory is that I advised changing a "the" to an "a." Since that time, I have been his pro bono but attentive editor. I will admit to intensifying my suggestions a lot since the 1977 letter, but the drill has never changed. He writes, I edit, and, alas, sometimes lose arguments about how a sentence should go. With my opting out of doing the 1983 article, Fortune turned to an outside writer, Andrew Tobias, who had almost come to work for the magazine several years earlier, our loss that he didn't, but who had instead embarked on a brilliant career of writing books, The Only Investment Guide You'll Ever Need, and freelance articles. Tobias says that when a Fortune editor called him about doing this piece, he had never heard of this guy, Buffett, who was said to have an almost cult following. Tobias then proceeded to do an article, far more than a book review, displaying his own humor and individuality. And did he next buy Berkshire stock, then selling around $1,000 a share, versus around $130,000 recently? Tobias answers, I tell people endlessly that Berkshire was the worst investment I ever made, for not making it. If I'd just taken the $1,500 that I remember Fortune paying me for the article, added a few dollars, and bought 2 shares, well, Tobias had the view back then, he says, that the stock was a little ahead of itself, and that when it dropped back a bit, he'd buy. He recalls thinking the same thing when the stock was $10,000 and $30,000. A redeeming fact is that Tobias and Buffett became good friends, drawn together not only by their conversations about this article, but also their mutual interest in supporting Democratic candidates. C.L.
Berkshire Hathaway shareholders have come to expect 2 things of their annual report. Good news, book value has increased from $19 to $737 per share in the last 18 years, and the unorthodox letter of their chairman, Warren Buffett, who took over 18 years ago. Indeed, the chairman's letter practically is the Berkshire Hathaway annual report. Shareholders get no photographs, no colored inks or foil embossing, no bar charts or graphs, not even a logo. It looks like the kind of annual you see from a company whose bubble has finally burst. Only Berkshire Hathaway, an insurer with major holdings in several other industries, is no bubble. And at $955 a share, up from $85 6 years ago, it shows no signs of bursting. The conventional wisdom in reading annual reports is to glance at the auditor's opinion, then check the financial results and the footnotes. The chairman's letter? Save your time. Yet of such interest are Warren Buffett's letters that they have drawn a sophisticated following, requests for reprints even. The company has assembled a compendium of the past 5 to meet the demand. "They're wonderful," says Leon Levy of Odyssey Partners, no minor Wall Street legend himself, whereupon he recounts the passage in the last letter that most amused him, the one in which Buffett says he wouldn't have wanted any part of the acquisitions most others were making in 1982. "For in many of these acquisitions," Buffett writes, "managerial intellect wilted in competition with managerial adrenaline. The thrill of the chase blinded pursuers to the consequences of the catch." Pascal's observation seems apt. "It has struck me that all men's misfortunes spring from the single cause that they are unable to stay quietly in one room." Your chairman left the room once too often last year and almost starred in the acquisition follies of 1982. In retrospect, our major accomplishment of the year was that a very large purchase to which we had firmly committed fell through for reasons totally beyond our control. Had it come off, this transaction would have consumed extraordinary amounts of time and energy, all for a most uncertain payoff. If we were to introduce graphics to this report illustrating favorable business developments of the past year, 2 blank pages depicting this blown deal would be the appropriate centerfold. "I love that," beams Levy. Buffett himself says he tries to talk to shareholders as if they were his partners. "I assume I've got a very intelligent partner who's been away for a year and needs to be filled in on all that's happened." He also assumes a little turnover among his 2,000 shareholders. "Rather than repeat the same things each year," he says, "I take up topics that further their education." It is an exercise he seems clearly to enjoy. The letters, currently running around 12 printed pages, get longer every year. The other extreme may have been reached last year by Wisconsin banker Jack Pulisher, another iconoclastic CEO, whose letter to Marshall and Ilsley shareholders read in its entirety, "Your company had a very good year in 1982. Some of it was due to luck. Some of it was due to good planning and management. We hope you enjoy the numbers and the pictures." Buffett's attention to his letters was sharpened by his service on an SEC panel formed in 1976 to study disclosure practices. The committee issued a 1,200-page document that concluded the disclosure system was basically sound. Former SEC Commissioner A. Sommer, Jr., who chaired the committee, himself a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder, says the group felt such letters were very important. Even so, he adds, "Warren's letters are unique. Damn few CEOs are as smart in as many ways as Warren. It would be awfully hard to require that kind of discussion from all CEOs." Does Buffett ever take on unorthodox subjects in his letters? Yes, he responds. He discusses his mistakes. The textile business again had a very poor year, he reported in 1977. When Buffett first took over Berkshire Hathaway in 1965, that's all it was, a New Bedford, Massachusetts textile manufacturer. We have mistakenly predicted better results in each of the last 2 years. Many difficulties experienced have been due primarily to industry conditions, but some of the problems have been of our own making. "We continue to look for ways to expand our insurance operation," he wrote his shareholders in 1979. "But your reaction to this intent should not be unrestrained joy. Some of our expansion efforts, largely initiated by your chairman, have been lackluster. Others have been expensive failures." Buffett downplays the excellence of his own efforts, but like a proud coach, highlights it in his players. Berkshire Hathaway owns a big chunk of Geico, the auto insurer, and of that company's brass he writes, Jack Byrne and Bill Snyder are achieving the most elusive of human goals, keeping things simple and remembering what you set out to do. And of an 81-year-old subsidiary chief, since deceased, our experience has been that the manager of an already high-cost operation frequently is uncommonly resourceful in finding new ways to add overhead, while the manager of a tightly run operation usually continues to find additional methods to curtail costs, even when his costs are already well below those of his competitors. No one has demonstrated this latter ability better than Gene Abegg. Here and there, notes of sentimentality pop up, but if Buffett wants to say something a little silly about the Washington Post Company, for which he delivered papers at the age of 13, or Geico, which first caught his eye at 20, it should be remembered that Berkshire's holdings in the one have risen in value from $11 million to $103 million, and in the other from $47 million to $310 million, both in under a decade. So he can say what he likes. Happily, he says it with a sense of humor. In a characteristically rash move, he writes, we have expanded world headquarters by 252 square feet, 17%. Coincidental with the signing of a new 5-year lease. World headquarters, in Omaha, houses, in addition to Buffett, 5 other people. A compact organization lets all of us spend our time managing the business rather than managing each other. Most chairmen's letters describe how well everything went under the circumstances, hoping the shareholders will buy it. Buffett's stress the negative, knowing that they won't. In the most recent report, immediately after observing that Berkshire Hathaway's 18-year rise in book value represents a 22% compound annual rate of growth, he adds, you can be certain that this percentage will diminish in the future. Geometric progressions eventually forge their own anchors. He's right, of course. Maintaining that rate for another 18 years would mean growing in book value to $22 billion, and after 18 years more, to nearly $1 million per share. Even when stating the paper gains in the Berkshire Hathaway portfolio, up 40% in 1982, he is careful first to subtract the taxes that would be paid if those gains were taken. To be sure, it's easy to be candid and self-deprecatory when any fool can see that you're terrific. What may be a tad galling to some of his peers is that Buffett's letters review not only his own performance and mistakes, but those of the rest of the nation's managers as well. There are indications, he writes, that several large insurers opted in 1982 for obscure accounting and reserving maneuvers that masked significant deterioration in their underlying businesses. In insurance, as elsewhere, the reaction of weak managements to weak operations is often weak accounting. His recurring theme, the rights of shareholders as trampled on by so many other managers. Well known are the corporate managers who fight heroically to fend off generous tender offers. Less sharply perceived are the managers who pay too much to grow by acquisition. Managers who want to expand their domain at the expense of owners, Buffett chides wryly, might better consider a career in government. It's even worse, in his view, when the acquisition is made with stock, because the acquirer's stock so often sells in the market for a discount to its true value. The acquirer who nevertheless barges ahead is using an undervalued currency, his stock, to pay for a fully valued property. Friendly investment bankers will reassure him as to the soundness of his actions. Don't ask the barber whether you need a haircut. In light of the enormous premium required to buy all of a company, Buffett's strategy has been one of partial acquisition. Where another company will bid $48 a share for all of a company whose shares were yesterday selling at $25, Buffett is content to buy quietly at $25. What really makes us dance, he admits, is to buy 100% of a business at a good price, but that is awfully hard to do. And so it is that at year's end, Berkshire Hathaway owned, among other holdings, chunks of blue chip stamps, 60%, Geico, 35%, General Foods, 4%, precious metals fabricator Handy and Harman, 17%, R.J. Reynolds, 2.7%, Interpublic, 15%, Ogilvy and Mather, 9%, Time Inc., publisher of Fortune, 2.7%, and the Washington Post Company, 13%. Berkshire Hathaway's reported earnings include its share of the earnings at Blue Chip Stamps, which it is merging with, but only the dividend income from the other companies in its investment portfolio. So Buffett must each year remind shareholders that reported profits exclude a large portion of its true earning power. This is not a criticism of accounting procedures, he hastens to add. We would not like to have the job of designing a better system. It's simply to say that managers and investors alike must understand that accounting numbers are the beginning, not the end, of business valuation. Lamenting the complexities of accounting, he reveals that the Yanomamo Indians employ only 3 numbers, 1, 2, and more than 2. Maybe their time will come. Because of the growing importance of the company's non-consolidated holdings, Buffett argues, it's no longer appropriate for shareholders to gauge Berkshire's performance by the ratio of reported earnings to equity, as, until recently, he had been advising they should. But then he adds, you should be suspicious of such an assertion. Yardsticks seldom are discarded while yielding favorable readings, but when results deteriorate, most managers favor disposition of the yardstick rather than disposition of the manager. To managers faced with such deterioration, a more flexible measurement system often suggests itself. Just shoot the arrow of business performance into a blank canvas and then carefully draw the bullseye around the implanted arrow. We generally believe in preset, long-lived, and small bullseyes. One of the bullseyes he considers notably unimpressive is the widely trumpeted achievement of record earnings. After all, he explains, even a totally dormant savings account will produce steadily rising interest earnings each year because of compounding. It's no surprise that Buffett would champion shareholders' rights. At 52, he has long been a professional shareholder himself. He and his wife own shares in Berkshire Hathaway recently worth $460 million, and Berkshire Hathaway is itself largely in the business of owning shares. Author Jerry Goldman in Supermoney labels Buffett easily the outstanding money manager of the generation, noting that a partnership he began in 1956 and had the consummate foresight to close down in 1969 achieved a compound annual growth of 31%. What was more remarkable, writes Goodman, was that he did it with the philosophy of another generation, just pure Benjamin Graham, applied with absolute consistency. The late Benjamin Graham, of course, authored The Intelligent Investor, in print almost continuously since 1949. Buffett chose Graham as a mentor, and, years later, Graham chose Buffett to help revise his book. Although Graham and Buffett did not agree on all things, their common perception was to buy assets so cheaply that, over time, they could hardly fail to profit. This approach calls for a level head and hard work. The market, like the Lord, Buffett writes, helps those who help themselves. But, unlike the Lord, the market does not forgive those who know not what they do. Buffett's strategy of partial acquisition makes sense. When companies are selling in the marketplace at a substantial discount to their true value as ongoing businesses, but not when the market, as it periodically does, jumps over the moon. In 1972, with Avon and the rest selling at 60 times earnings, Berkshire had only 15% of its portfolio in equities versus 80% at the end of 1982. There were as many good businesses around in 1972 as in 1982, he writes, but the prices the stock market placed upon those businesses in 1972 looked absurd. Should the stock market keep climbing, he warns, Berkshire's ability to utilize capital effectively in partial ownership positions will be reduced or eliminated. We currently are seeing early traces of this problem. Damn, another bull market. One problem all Buffett's letters address is the state of the property casualty insurance industry, his core business. For much of this century, he writes, a large portion of the industry worked, in effect, within a legal quasi-administered pricing system fostered by insurance regulators. While price competition existed, it was not pervasive among the larger companies. That gentlemanly day, says Buffett, is gone. Although parts of the old structure remain, the new capacity is not reluctant to use price as a prime competitive weapon. Indeed, it relishes that use. In the process, customers have learned that insurance is no longer a one-price business. They won't forget. It is Buffett's plan to live with low volume while he waits for the shakeout that will cause prices to firm. He is less confident, letter after letter, of the prospects for the textile industry, a capital-intensive commodity business in which periods of tight supply, and hence decent prices, come around only rarely, and then last only the better part of a morning. Out of loyalty to his employees, however, and perhaps out of a certain nostalgia for Berkshire's roots, Buffett steadfastly refuses to abandon his business. Such behavior might seem to flout the interests of Berkshire shareholders. Only with 47% of the company stock, Buffett is able to summon a majority vote for his policy, or any other, practically all by himself. Even so, he assures his shareholders it's not the kind of business he is eager to enter in the future. Among the final notes in Buffett's letters is a virtual "businesses wanted" classified. It tells a lot about how Warren Buffett operates. Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett writes, is looking for large, simple businesses. If there's a lot of technology, we won't understand it. With consistent earning power, little debt, management in place, we can't supply it, and an offering price. We don't want to waste our time or that of the seller by talking, even preliminarily, when price is unknown. We will not engage in unfriendly transactions. We can promise complete confidentiality and a very fast answer as to possible interest, customarily within 5 minutes. To write an interesting chairman's letter, it helps if you are a chairman with interesting ideas. Buffett's is a refreshing style, in business as in prose.
From Can You Beat the Stock Market? December 26, 1983. An excerpt and a sidebar from an article by Daniel Siegelman. The Efficient Market Hypothesis, EMH, as this article incisively says, holds that the stock market cannot be beaten by mere mortals. To all those believing in EMH, therefore, Buffett's long record in successfully picking stocks was, at the very least, discordant. The usual reaction of the believers was to describe Buffett as just lucky, extraordinarily, damnably lucky. As Buffett's fame grew, however, he came to be viewed as an anomaly, an investor whose superb record could just not be explained away by chance. This development did not thrill Fortune's Dan Siegelman, who wrote this article. A mentor and close friend of mine, Siegelman was intellectually drawn to EMH, a leaning he discloses in the article, and much preferred that it be proved right. But his honesty and news sense told him there was a fine, unreported story here, and he proceeded to write it. We have not reprinted the entire article, only its beginning and a core section, and an accompanying sidebar that describes Buffett and his three longtime friends, Charlie Munger, the late Bill Ruane, and the late Walter Schloss. The full story is available online. But beware that it basically describes a relic, since EMH has largely been assigned to the dustbin. There was an important postscript to the article, a May 1984 debate about EMH, staged by Columbia University and pitting Buffett against a well-known business school academic, University of Rochester finance professor Michael Jensen. Speaking first, Jensen expressed his strong belief in EMH, gave his reasons cogently, and then ended with a specific reference to Fortune's article, an excellent review of EMH, he said. But it would be wrong, he contended, to think that the standout investment records of Buffett and the other three men were undeniably attributable to skill. Statistically, he said, citing coin-flipping probabilities, the records could just as easily have been compiled by luck. Not so, said Buffett, realizing he'd been given a lift-off into the very argument he had planned to make. To himself and the three other investors named above, Buffett added 5 more coin flippers, calling this group of 9 the super investors of Graham and Doddsville. All 9, he explained, describing each, had a common intellectual father, famed investor and author Ben Graham, who believed that investors should search for discrepancies between the value of a business and the price of small pieces of that business in the market. These 9 investors, however, said Buffett, had produced their records in widely different ways, with very few stocks duplicated among their portfolios. In other words, they were residents of the same intellectual village, but varied in how they plied their trade. To call their superior records luck, said Buffett, would be absurd. Attending that debate, I felt that Buffett had decisively bested Jensen, a conclusion that indeed became the consensus about the event. Buffett himself feels that of all the written and oral presentations he has given, this one was the most logically reasoned and therefore the best. The super investors of Graham and Doddsville can be accessed on the Internet. C.L.
Most people interested in the stock market fall into one of 3 categories. 1. Academic scholars who doubt anybody really knows how to beat the market. 2. Professional investors who indignantly reject this view of the matter. And 3. Amateur investors who also believe that you can beat the market, but don't realize how controversial this assumption is. I have long been a partisan of the first group, and, until the last year or so, had assumed that its case was airtight. The professors seem to have built an overwhelming case for the so-called efficiency market hypothesis, EMH. If you think of the hypothesis as a literal description of the real world, the stock market cannot be beaten by mere mortals. Question: how close to reality is EMH? Having now resurveyed the basic case made for it in the business schools and also looked at some recent findings that seem inconsistent with it, I find myself answering that EMH is extremely useful for understanding the stock market, but doubting that it's as close to reality as I had previously assumed. It seems fairly clear that some superior investors are out there beating the market systematically. Like many other EMH fans, I have been shaken by the proliferation of anomalies, this being the professor's preferred term for stock market news that seems to confound the hypothesis. One disturbing anomaly centers on the extraordinary records compiled by certain high-visibility investors. The records of one tightly knit group of investors of whom Warren Buffett is the best known are laid out below. Buffett is very much aware of the extent to which his investment record constitutes a challenge to the efficient market hypothesis. He believes that there are exploitable pockets of inefficiency in the market, and he has at several times argued his case in appearances at the Stanford Business School on whose advisory council he serves. Speaking to the council, Professor William F. Sharp of Stanford, one of the school's academic stars and the author of a popular textbook solidly endorsing EMH, once referred to Buffett as a 5 sigma event. In business school lingo, this superlative signifies that you should think of his investment performance as being 5 standard deviations above the mean. If literally true, no one claims that it is, this should tell us that there is only about 1 chance in 3.5 million of compiling an investment record like Buffett's by chance. You Only Swing on 3-0, a sidebar by Daniel Seligman. In principle, says the efficient market hypothesis, no one can systematically beat the stock market. In applying EMH to Warren Buffett, Charles Munger, William Ruane, and Walter Schloss, you would have 3 difficulties. 1. All have outperformed the market over long periods. 2. They have generally done so in both bullish and bearish environments, so it's hard to argue that their higher returns simply reflect greater risk-taking. And 3. All are pursuing strategies that reflect the ideas of the late Benjamin Graham, so it's hard to view their performance as a random event. Buffett, Ruane, and Schloss all studied under Graham, and all 4 have been influenced by his classic security analysis written with David L. Dodd and first published in 1934. Graham's core idea: look for companies that for some reason are undervalued and hold the stocks for as long as it takes the market to see the values. Obviously, such companies are hard to find. Says Buffett, you wait for the 3-0 pitch. Prize example of what you get by waiting? The Washington Post Company in 1974, when its market value was $80 million, and its TV stations alone were worth more than that. Now its market value is about $1 billion, and Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway owns 13%. Buffett himself has not formally been in the money management business since 1969, when he dissolved the Buffett Partnership Limited after nearly 14 years of operation. One reason for the dissolution? Buffett had stopped finding undervalued securities. During its lifetime, the partnership had an annual average return of 29.5% versus 8.2% for the S&P 500. Like the figures below, these assume annual reinvestment of dividends. Charles Munger's partnership, Wheeler, Munger and Company, operated from 1962 to 1975. It had an average return of 19.8% versus 5.3% for the S&P 500. Bill Ruane runs the immensely successful Sequoia Fund, which was first offered to the public in July 1970, and since then has had an average return of 18.6% versus 10.6% for the S&P. Sequoia now has $333 million of assets and has suspended sales to new investors because, says Ruane, the money was coming in faster than I had ideas. The private partnership run by Walter Schloss since 1956 has had an average return of 21.3% versus 8.7% for the S&P. In a recent sentimental letter to his partners, Schloss saluted Graham and security analysis, which helped many of us along a rocky road.
Buffett and Capital Cities ABC. The acquisition of American Broadcasting Companies by Capital Cities Communications in 1985 and Berkshire's involvement in the deal was a combination and investment that Buffett liked from the beginning, particularly because it put him into business with his longtime friend, Cap Cities chairman Thomas S. Murphy. The deal did not disappoint. Cap Cities ABC flourished and in 1996 was bought by Walt Disney Company, with Berkshire more than quadrupling its original investment. Here are 4 Fortune excerpts that describe key moments along the way. CL. From Capital Cities' Capital Coup, April 15, 1985. An excerpt from an article by Stratford Sherman.
Buffett says of Murphy, "I think he is the top manager in the U.S." No slouch as a manager himself, Buffett has placed a substantial part of his future in Murphy's hands. Buffett helped bring off the friendly acquisition by agreeing to buy about 18% of the merged company Capital Cities ABC Inc. for $518 million. More extraordinary, Buffett agreed to vote with management for 11 years on condition that either Murphy or President Daniel Burke be in charge, and accepted severe limitations on his freedom to buy and sell the stock.
From Merger Fees That Bend the Mind, January 20, 1986, by Peter Petrie.
Faced with towering investment banker fees, some corporate chieftains play do-it-yourself. Successful do-it-yourselfers tend to be financiers with extraordinary talent for sizing up a transaction. One of these faced down two of Wall Street's most famous gunslingers. Warren Buffett stepped in last March on behalf of Capital Cities Communications in its effort to acquire American broadcasting companies. He went into negotiations assisted by merger lawyer Martin Lipton of the law firm Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen & Katz. Across the table were Bruce Wasserstein, co-director of First Boston's Mergers and Acquisitions Department, and takeover specialist Joseph Flom of the law firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher & Flom. As the two sides neared an argument, the professional deal-makers held out for more. "Buffett is so smart," remembers Wasserstein, "that you had to be careful to avoid being picked." As the deal-maker tells it, he and Flom demanded that Cap Cities sweeten its cash offer for ABC with stock. But Buffett, who was not to be pushed far, finally closed by throwing in some small change, a thin veneer of warrants that raised the deal's value by perhaps 3%. Buffett has declined to comment.
From The Inside Story of Time Warner, November 20, 1989, by Bill Saporito.
In the mid-'80s, Time Inc. CEO J. Richard Monroe saw a way to attack all of his big problems: hook up through acquisition or merger with another media giant. In the fall of 1988, Warren Buffett came by with his friends from Capital Cities ABC, in which he was a major investor. Monroe and Time Inc. President Nicholas J. "Nick" Nicholas Jr. met with Buffett and Cap Cities CEO Thomas Murphy and President Daniel Burke. The meetings continued into December until, according to Nicholas, Murphy mentioned that in any deal there should be one or two more Cap City directors than Time directors. Monroe says he told Murphy, a good friend, "Thank you very much, but Time Inc. is not for sale." A Cap Cities source says the two men couldn't agree on who would be boss. Time had rebuffed Buffett before. In 1984, he had asked Monroe informally about acquiring up to 10% of Time Inc.'s stock, enough to frighten a raider. Buffett's practice with other large stockholding is to hang on to them for years or decades and become a trusted board member and advisor. But when Monroe took Buffett's feeler to the Time Inc. board, the directors, to Monroe's regret, discouraged him from pursuing it.
From Buffett to Disney, All Thumbs Up, April 1, 1996, by Carol Loomis. Just in from Omaha and making a do-it-yourself delivery, Berkshire Hathaway chairman Warren Buffett strolled into the downtown Manhattan offices of Harris Trust on March 5th and handed 2 envelopes to a Harris officer. In envelope number 1 was stock worth, gulp, $2.5 billion, Berkshire's 20 million shares of Capital Cities ABC being delivered to the company's purchaser, Walt Disney Company. In envelope number 2, sealed and marked "Do not open until 4:30 p.m. on March 7," were Buffett's wishes, kept secret even from the managements of Disney and Cap Cities, as to how he wanted Berkshire to be paid for the contents of envelope number 1. Like any ordinary Cap Cities stockholder, Buffett had the option of taking the standard package, which was Disney stock plus cash, or requesting all stock or all cash. And the envelope, please? Giving Disney a huge thumbs up, Buffett asked for stock only. Talking to Disney's CEO Michael Eisner late on the 7th, Buffett said he had paid the company and its boss his ultimate compliment by entrusting them with Berkshire's money. Eisner assured Buffett he'd work to make the decision right. In Berkshire's 1995 annual report, due out momentarily, Buffett will acknowledge that he is returning to the scene of an investing crime. Attracted to Disney in 1966 by its film library, its burgeoning theme park business, and its peanut gallery stock price, the market capitalization of the entire company was less than $90 million. Buffett invested a large chunk of Buffett partnership money in the stock at a split-adjusted price of 31 cents a share. The stock recently sold for $65. But did Buffett hang around for the ride? No. He sold out in 1967 at 48 cents a share. "Oh well," says Buffett, with surely a wince, "it's nice to be back." Editor's note: back, yes, but not for long. For a time, true, Buffett liked Disney, even adding shares to the large Disney stake that Berkshire received when the deal closed. But then Disney went through a period of management turmoil. Frank Wells died. Michael Ovitz failed as a manager. And Buffett turned thumbs down on the investment. By 1999, Berkshire was completely out of Disney. The full text of the 4 Cap Cities articles excerpted is available at fortune.com/BuffettBook. From Beating the Market by Buying Back Stock, April 29, 1985. An excerpt from an article by Carol Loomis. Making a groundbreaking study of stock buybacks, Fortune found that, on average, large benefits accrued to the stockholders of companies buying insignificant quantities of their own stock. This article also presented many pro and con opinions, some of them Buffett's, about repurchases. Buffett was then, as now, a fan of managements who bought in stocks for the right reason, because they knew their stocks to be undervalued. Conversely, he has always disdained managers who buy because they are trying to prop their stock or counteract the effects of stock options, which tend to shovel new shares into the market. The only reason for a company to repurchase its stock, Buffett has often said, is because it is selling for less than it's worth. Buffett's views about repurchases sometimes have drawn perplexed or even indignant questions at Berkshire annual meetings because he has not appeared to be practicing what he preaches. Why, shareholders would ask, had not Berkshire itself repurchased shares when they were undervalued? In 2009, in fact, one questioner virtually quoted from this article, reminding Buffett that he has said, "The stock market will discount the prices of companies that should be buying back their stock and don't." Over the years, Buffett has responded in several ways. The Internet bubble days, when Berkshire was thought antediluvian and its shares were sinking toward $40,000, Buffett conceded that in the past he had sometimes erred in not making repurchases. "My appraisal of Berkshire's value," he wrote in the 1999 annual report letter, "was then too conservative, or I was too enthused about some alternative use of funds." He then used the letter to open the door to repurchases. He said that after shareholders had a chance to read his discussion and understand the issues, Berkshire would entertain the offers of shareholders who wished to sell stock. And what happened? Nothing that led to Berkshire buying shares. Buffett says that the very few offers that came in were asking for prices that he was unwilling to pay. After that non-event, Buffett said on more than one occasion that a move by Berkshire to buy in shares would be self-defeating. That is, the mere announcement by the company that it would repurchase stock, a disclosure that would be required, he said, would send up the price and make the shares no longer attractive to buy. In other words, these are my words, definitely not his, if Warren Buffett, a genius at identifying undervalued stocks, were to indicate that Berkshire was so cheap it should be bought, it would immediately rise to a price not cheap. An acid test of this proposition came on September 26, 2011, when book value of Berkshire A stock was about $96,900, and the stock had on some days dipped below $100,000. Buffett announced then that Berkshire's board had authorized the company to buy shares, A or B, at a price no higher than 10% above book value. Within the day, the stock jumped to a price over Buffett's limit, and by all rights, Berkshire should not have been able to buy any shares. But a few shareholders nevertheless made offers within Buffett's range. Berkshire bought in 98 shares of A stock and 802,000 of B, for about $67 million in total. Pocket change for a company that could have, and probably would have, paid billions to buy. One message from this episode. If Berkshire stock gets down close to book value, a figure that changes every day, of course, Buffett will no doubt, again, consider it cheap. Here, from the 1985 article, are the paragraphs about Buffett. CL. One buyback enthusiast is Warren E. Buffett, the noted Omaha investor. The company he controls is due to acquire 18% of Capital Cities in the ABC deal, in which Cap Cities acquired ABC. And that will become his biggest investment. But right now his 4 largest common stock holdings are in corporations that have, as Cap Cities has, repurchased substantial amounts of stock: Geico, General Foods, Exxon, and Washington Post. The Exxon investment is new, built up only after the company started acquiring its shares in 1983. A big reason I got in, Buffett says, is that the company has recognized the values in its stock and been smart enough and pro-shareholder enough to repurchase it. On the other hand, Buffett has sold the stocks of certain companies because they would not make repurchases. He is convinced, in fact, that the market discounts the prices of companies that should be making repurchases and don't, instead frittering away their money on acquisitions or other investments of far less value. The corollary, he says, is a markup in prices for companies that do repurchase shares, because investors identify the buybacks as a sign that management will be consistently inclined to act in the interests of shareholders. All managements say they're acting in the shareholders' interests, he observes. What you'd like to do as an investor is hook them up to a machine and run a polygraph to see whether it's true. Short of a polygraph, the best sign of a shareholder-oriented management, assuming its stock is undervalued, is repurchases. A polygraph proxy. That's what it is. The full text of Beating the Market by Buying Back Stock is available at fortune.com/BuffettBook. Guess Who's Bought Whoops Bonds? April 29, 1985. By Kenneth Labiche. By the mid-1980s, Buffett's reputation had grown to the point that every investment move he made was news. And in early 1985, the revelation was Berkshire's purchase of that frequent butt of investment jokes, Hoops bonds. In his chairman's letter in Berkshire's 1985 annual report, published days before this article came out, Buffett took pains to explain both this off-the-wall investment and the prosaic considerations, beware inflation, for example, that go into buying bonds generally. Investors, Buffett stressed, need to think about the prices of securities, or more precisely, the mispricing that an investor hopes to identify and exploit. Said that letter, Charlie, Munger, and I judged the risks at the time we purchased the bonds and at the prices Berkshire paid, much lower than present prices, to be considerably more than compensated for by prospects of profit. In that letter, Buffett also stated his opinions, laid out in many of his annual reports, about buying businesses in their entirety or in the pieces that stock, and occasionally bonds, represent. He wrote, "We feel that if we can buy small pieces of businesses with satisfactory underlying economic at a fraction of the per-share value of the entire business, something good is likely to happen to us." It did in the Hoops case. In the aggregate, Berkshire bought $260 million of the bonds, holding varying quantities from 1983 into the early 1990s. On this investment, Berkshire reaped tax-free interest of $263 million and in time, upon disposing of the bonds, recorded capital gains of $68 million. CL.
In building his reputation as one of America's most astute investors, Warren Buffett has often startled Wall Street with bold, unexpected moves. Lately, he's been springing them fortnightly. Having just played a big part in Capital Cities Communications' deal to take over American Broadcasting Companies, the 54-year-old chairman of Omaha-based Berkshire Hathaway, Inc., has come up with another stunner. Buffett revealed in the Berkshire Hathaway annual report that he has spent $139 million to buy long-term bonds issued by the Washington Public Power Supply System, WPPSS, the notorious nuclear construction agency in Washington state, that defaulted on $2.25 billion of bonds in 1983 and has come to be known as Whoops. The municipal corporation composed of towns and utility districts, WPPSS began construction of 5 huge nuclear power plants in the 1970s. Buffett didn't buy the defaulted bonds issued to finance nuclear generating units 4 and 5. WPPSS scrapped these 2 plants during the earlier stages of construction after costs ran way over budget and evidence emerged that the region had overestimated its power needs. Buffett's bonds are tied to Units 1, 2, and 3. They have continued to pay interest because, unlike the bonds for Units 4 and 5, they are backed by a regional federal power agency. So far, Buffett seems to have triumphed again. Because he started buying the bonds not long after the well-publicized default brought a plunge in all WPPSS bonds, he locked in an attractive 16.3% tax-free current yield, a $22.7 million annual return on his investment. In addition, his 1, 2, and 3 bonds appreciated by about 13% by the end of 1984. Still, the WPPSS venture is a departure for Buffett. Though Berkshire Hathaway, an insurance retail and publishing conglomerate, holds large amounts of bonds, Buffett's forte is buying shares in companies whose values he believes have been underestimated by the stock market. His WPPSS purchases are a dicier proposition, as he is quick to admit. Only one of the 3 nuclear reactors financed by the bonds has gone online. Work on the other 2 has been suspended because their output won't be needed until the mid-1990s. The mothballing calls into question WPPSS's long-term financial stability. Investors holding the defaulted bonds and other parties have filed dozens of lawsuits against WPPSS, and interest payments could be interrupted. Buffett even warns shareholders of a very slight risk that the business could be worth nothing within a year or two. Buffett doesn't seem concerned about such an outcome. Neither does he judge himself or expect to be judged by others on the basis of one investment decision. It's the overall record that counts. Buffett's record has been astounding. Owner of 41% of Berkshire Hathaway, he currently manages more than $1.7 billion in company investments. Berkshire Hathaway shares that were selling for $40 10 years ago now command well over $1,800. Slumped on a couch in his modest office, the genial Nebraskan compares the WPPSS investment to other unconventional moves he's made over the years, most notably his plunge into American Express stock right after a 1963 contretemps involving master swindler Tino de Angelis. The case, which became known as the Salad Oil Scandal, involved an obscure American Express warehousing subsidiary that issued receipts for large quantities of cottonseed and soybean oil that proved non-existent. Though many on Wall Street feared the affair would bankrupt American Express, Buffett and some partners took a chance and bought 5% of the company's shares at fire sale prices. In the end, American Express's liability turned out to be far less than originally suspected. The stock skyrocketed, and Buffett's contrariety triumphed. "Things aren't right just because they are unpopular," Buffett says with a chuckle. "But it is a good pond in which to fish. You pay a lot on Wall Street for a cheery consensus." WPPSS is a contrarian's paradise. Bondholders in Units 1, 2, and 3 have just survived a hair-raising legal challenge. They get their interest payments because the federal government's Bonneville Power Administration, which sells hydroelectric power to towns and utilities throughout the Northwest, has earmarked some of its revenues to pay the 1, 2, and 3 bondholders. The town of Springfield, Oregon, which had contracted to buy power from the WPPSS nuclear projects, asked the courts to look into this setup because ratepayers had questioned its legality. In February, a U.S. appeals court in San Francisco allowed the arrangement to stand. More litigation on this issue is possible, and other worries abound. To meet the interest payments, Bonneville must have a reliable cash flow, which partly depends on adequate rainfall for the dams whose power it sells. Nor can it count on selling all the kilowatts. Aluminum smelters, the major industrial customers in the region, have been hurt by foreign competition, and Bonneville has had to lower rates to keep them going. Another fear for 1, 2, and 3 bondholders is that a court will decide that 4 and 5 bondholders are entitled to part of the revenues now being sluiced through Bonneville to 1, 2, and 3. WPPSS watchers call the current partition between the two classes of bondholders the Chinese Wall. Most dangerous of all for 1, 2, and 3 bondholders is the possibility that WPPSS might declare bankruptcy. Since no public agency of this size has gone bankrupt in the U.S., no one is quite sure how 1, 2, and 3 bonds might fare. Given all these imponderables, many municipal bond specialists have advised clients to stay away from WPPSS. A West Coast bond expert compares a WPPSS investment to troop convoys crossing the North Atlantic during World War II. "You're pretty sure some torpedoes will be aimed at you," he says, "but you don't know if you're going to get hit." The two major bond rating agencies on Wall Street, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, have both refused to rate WPPSS 1, 2, and 3 bonds. Yet other bond experts share Buffett's enthusiasm for the high WPPSS yields. Says Robert Adler, Vice President of the Municipal Bond Department at Shearson Lehman Brothers, They're not investment-grade quality bonds, but they could work for a high-net-worth individual who understands the risks. Apparently, American Express, which owns Shearson Lehman, is less bullish. In 1984, an American Express insurance subsidiary unloaded WPPSS 1, 2, and 3 bonds worth $76 million. Howard Sitzer, director of municipal bond research at Thomson McKinnon Securities, recommends WPPSS 1, 2, and 3. He argues that Bondville, which had gross revenues of $2.7 billion in 1984, can cover its $570 million or so in WPPSS interest obligations for some time. Sitzer also sees little possibility of a WPPSS bankruptcy. Buffett maintains that his decision to buy WPPSS, like all his other investment decisions, followed a hard-headed analysis of the underlying values. He points out, for example, that the after-tax earnings on his bonds would normally require an investment at least twice as big. Before pushing ahead, Buffett says he carefully surveyed the hazards. "We don't make judgments based on ratings," he adds. "If we wanted Moody's and Standard & Poor's to run our money, we'd give it to them." Buffett adds rather proudly that his Omaha headquarters has no computers, and that his analyses are based on no electronic data. Says he, "We read, that's about it." Buffett won't say whether he has bought more WPPSS bonds or has lightened his holdings since the end of last year. His commitment to invest $517.5 million in ABC won't necessarily force him to sell the WPPSS bonds to raise money. He can tap his company's cash flow and liquid assets or resort to his considerable borrowing power. Berkshire Hathaway also holds large blocks of communications stocks, including 4% of Time Inc., publisher of Fortune, some of which the Federal Communications Commission may force him to sell as a condition for investing in ABC. Buffett says that occasions to buy bonds in the future are likely to be few. He is concerned that the federal budget deficit will lead to substantially higher inflation and surging interest rates, a disastrous situation for bondholders. "In runaway inflation," says Buffett, "what you've bought is wallpaper." While Buffett has been making news lately, he doesn't make a lot of investments. "My problem is I don't get 50 great ideas a year," he says. "I'm lucky if I get 1 or 2. But when he does decide to plunge, he gets big. In the latest annual report, Buffett warns shareholders that betting heavily on a few ideas is bound to produce a bad year once in a while. That may be, but so far the shareholders have had plenty to whoop about.
From Now Hear This, April 28, 1986. Our gain in net worth during the year was $613.6 million, or 48.2%. It is fitting that the visit of Halley's Comet coincided with this percentage gain. Neither will be seen again in my lifetime. Warren E. Buffett, 55, chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, in the company's 1985 annual report. Editor's note: actually, Buffett was wrong. The gain 13 years later in 1998 was a peg higher, 48.3%, with no accompanying Halley's Comet. But in his 1998 letter, Buffett dismissed the accomplishment, saying that most of the gain was simply the effect of Berkshire's issuing shares during the year to make acquisitions, principally NetJets and General Ray, at a time when its stock was selling at a large premium over book value. It was no accident, of course, that Buffett was issuing Berkshire stock in a year when its price related to a more important indicator, intrinsic value, was also high. He would regard it as sinful to hand out Berkshire shares when they are the opposite. Cheap, so to speak. From Should You Leave It All to the Children? September 29, 1986. Excerpts from an article by Richard I. Kirkland, Jr. This story put Warren Buffett on the cover of Fortune for the first time, though certainly not the last. Still, Buffett was only the principal actor in a long story that also included a large supporting cast, all of its members rich. So we have simply excerpted the Buffett paragraphs, including those opening the article. Buffett's strongly negative views about large inheritances, opinions known to me, prompted this story. But there was definitely no shortage of other rich people willing to talk, remembers writer Rick Kirkland, who later became Fortune's managing editor. His piece proceeded to hit a nerve with readers as well. Said Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, upon spotting a Fortune editor at a Washington party, "Everyone is talking about your story. Even today, a quarter-century after the article was published, Buffett gets questions about it, as if, he says, readers had cut it out and saved it." His daughter, Susie, the oldest of 3 Buffett children, the others sons Howard and Peter, probably fields questions still more often because of one anecdote included in the story. Susie says that people she meets still ask her incredulously, "He wouldn't give you money to fix up your kitchen?" Buffett thought then that a few $100,000 might be appropriate for a child to inherit. Even now, he remains in the parsimonious camp. But as the years passed, inflation and his own reflections changed his opinions about what his children should get and led him to revise, upwardly, those early thoughts about a few $100,000. For many years, he did not publicly disclose where his thinking had taken him. But at a 2010 dinner in New York, amid a small group of people loaded with money, Buffett made news by spelling out for the first time what his children had up to then received and would further receive at his death. He said that when his first wife, Susie, died in 2004, her will had left each of the 3 children $10 million, and that his will, which he happened to have just rewritten, provided that each would receive $15 million. For Buffett's 3 children, therefore, that's a total of 75 million, as in million with an M. His fortune, as he spoke, was close to 50 billion with a B. Obviously, he still believes that, no, you shouldn't leave it all to the children. Neither does he expect to hand the management of Berkshire Hathaway down to his children, though that matter is nuanced. Believing that a member of his family could best preserve the company's culture, Buffett has said that he hopes his older son, Howard, will succeed him as Berkshire's chairman when the need arises. But the active management of the company is to be taken over by non-family members. To all of this, there is an implied codicil relating to philanthropy. In 1999, well before Susie Buffett's death, she and Warren had encouraged their children to move into philanthropy by giving each of them $10 million for the establishment of their own foundations. Later, additional gifts, some bestowed by Susie's will, raised each of the foundations to more than $100 million in size. Then came what son and author Peter Buffett, see page 316 for an article about him, has called the Big Bang. This was Warren Buffett's stunning 2006 announcement, made by means of a Fortune article, that he would gradually give away most of his fortune to 5 foundations, the 3 run by his children among them. Since then, each of those 3 foundations has received shares worth close to $400 million at the dates of the gifts. The stakes were upped still more on August 30th, 2012, as Buffett, celebrating his 82nd birthday that day, announced that he would henceforth double the shares of stock he will give the foundations run by his children. The price of Berkshire stock over the years will determine the amount bestowed. But it is easy to imagine that the total gift emanating from the original Big Bang and its 2012 variation will reach $2 billion for each foundation and perhaps a good deal more. The Fortune article that disclosed Buffett's huge gift begins on page 256 of this book. CL. As the article begins.
Warren Buffett, 56, the chairman and guiding genius of Berkshire Hathaway, the phenomenally successful holding company, is worth at least $1.5 billion. But don't bother being jealous of his 3 children. Buffett does not believe that it is wise to bequeath great wealth and plans to give most of his money to his charitable foundation. Having put his daughter and 2 sons through college, the Omaha investor contents himself with giving them several $1,000s each at Christmas. Beyond that, says daughter Susan, 33, if I write my dad a check for $20, he cashes it. Buffett is not cutting his children out of the family fortune because they're wastrels or wantons or refuse to go into the family business. The traditional reasons rich parents withhold money. Says he, my kids are going to carve out their place in this world, and they know I'm for them whatever they want to do. But he believes that setting up his heirs with a lifetime supply of food stamps just because they came out of the right womb can be harmful for them and is an antisocial act. To him, the perfect amount to leave children is enough money so they would feel they could do anything, but not so much that they could do nothing. For a college graduate, Buffett reckons a few $100,000 sounds about right. How much should you leave the kids? Agonizing over that question is a peculiarly American obsession. In much of the world, custom and law dictate that children, unless they have committed some particularly heinous crime, automatically receive most of the parents' wealth when they die. Only Britain and her colonies, common law countries all, give property owners the right to leave their children whatever they want.
As the article continues midway,
some rich individuals argue that not giving money to the children can cause problems too. Says one, if you're the child and you see your father with all this dough and you get some but not much, I just can't help thinking resentment will enter in. Susan Buffett, who works in Washington as an administrative assistant to the editor of U.S. News and World Report and is married to a public interest lawyer, admits her father's position is tough to live with. My dad is one of the most honest, principled good guys I know, she says, and I basically agree with him. But it's sort of strange when you know most parents want to buy things for their kids and all you need is a small sum of money to fix up the kitchen, not to go to the beach for 6 months. He won't give it to us on principle. All my life, my father has been teaching us. Well, I feel I've learned the lesson. At a certain point, you can stop.
and further along,
Warren Buffett argues that most proprietors should forget trying to keep the management of their beloved companies in the family. He assumes current non-family management will continue running Berkshire after he is gone. He grants that occasionally an heir may be the most suitable candidate to manage a company, but believes the odds are against it. Says Buffett, would anyone say the best way to pick a championship Olympic team is to select the sons and daughters of those who won 20 years ago? Giving someone a favored position just because his old man accomplished something is a crazy way for a society to compete.
dial BUFFETT for merger. December 22nd, 1986. From News Trends section. In one of the most unusual want ads in the Wall Street Journal has ever run, Warren E. Buffett, 56, the chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, Inc., announced that he was looking to buy businesses worth $100 million or more before December 31st, 1986. We have the money, reads the $47,000 nearly full-page ad, and we can act with extraordinary speed. If you have any possible interest, call promptly. The reason to act fast is the tax law that takes effect January 1st. While the jump in the federal capital gains tax rate for individuals from 20% to 28% is alarming enough, Buffett warns that business owners could pay the equivalent of a 52.5% capital gains tax if they wait until after December 31st to sell. He comes up with that figure by considering the new 34% capital gains tax that corporations must pay on the sale of a business and the 28% that shareholders owe on the remaining capital gain. Says Buffett, many companies have a reason to beat the clock. Before you rush to your telephone, however, be warned that not just any potential acquisition will do. The company must have, quote, at least $10 million of after-tax earnings and preferably much more, according to the ad, and must also boast good return on equity, little or no debt, and a management in place. It should also be in a simple business. If there's lots of technology, we won't understand it. Editor's note: Buffett got no takers. Early fears about index futures, December 7, 1987. A warning letter sent by Warren Buffett to Congressman John Dingell, Jr. In mid-October of 1987, a week of vicious selling in the stock market culminated on Black Monday, the 19th, when the Dow Industrials average dropped by 22.6%. As the causes of the crash came under intense investigation, attention focused on the role played by a derivative, S&P index futures, in which trading had been permitted for only a few years. In particular, institutional investors following a portfolio insurance strategy had repeatedly shorted S&P index futures, with their trading drawing in other institutional investors who did the same, thereby magnifying the market panic. Suddenly, there was a remarkable timeliness to, and a strong reason for Fortune to, publish a letter that Buffett had written years earlier in 1982 to Congressman John Dingell, Jr., Democrat from Michigan, then chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. Congress was in that year debating whether to allow the Chicago Mercantile Exchange to begin trading futures contracts tied to the level of stock indexes. Dingell was opposed to that plan, and so, he learned, was Buffett. The two men knew each other a little because many years before, their fathers, both congressmen, had been friends. Though Howard Buffett, Republican from Nebraska, was an arch conservative, and John Dingell, the senior, Democrat from Michigan, was the polar opposite. Against that background, the younger Dingell asked the younger Buffett to explain in a letter why he thought trading in stock index futures was a bad idea. Said Buffett, as he wound up his carefully reasoned letter, "We do not need more people gambling in non-essential instruments identified with the stock market in this country, nor brokers who encourage them to do so." Dingell and Buffett were, of course, on the losing side of this argument. Trading in S&P futures began on the Merc in April 1982 and, notwithstanding crises like the one in 1987, mushroomed. The contract was then eclipsed 25 years later by its electronic offspring, S&P E-mini futures, which speculators could trade in for relatively small amounts and which quickly became the king of contracts. When the flash crash of May 2010 occurred, terrifying many investors, E-mini contracts accounted for a huge portion of the volume. Below is the letter that Buffett sent to Congressman Dingell in 1982. CL.
This letter is to comment upon the likely sources for trading activity that will develop any futures market involving stock indexes. My background for this commentary is some 30 years of practice in various aspects of the investment business, including several years as a securities salesman. The last 25 years have been spent as a financial analyst, and I currently have the sole responsibility for an equity portfolio that totals over $600 million. It is impossible to predict precisely what will develop in investment or speculative markets, and you should be wary of any who claim precision. I think the following represents a reasonable expectancy. 1. A role can be performed by the stock index future contract in aiding the risk-reducing efforts of the true investor. An investor may quite logically conclude that he can identify undervalued securities, but also conclude that he has no ability whatsoever to predict the short-term movements of the stock market. This is the view I maintain in my own efforts in investment management. Such an investor may wish to zero out market fluctuations, and the continual shortening of a representative index offers him the chance to do just that. Presumably, an investor with $10 million of undervalued equities and a constant short position of $10 million in the index will achieve the net rewards or penalties attributable solely to his skill in selection of specific securities, and have no worries that these results will be swamped or even influenced by the fluctuations of the general market. Because there are costs involved, and because most investors believe that over the long term, stock prices in general will advance, I think there are relatively few investment professionals who will operate in such a constantly hedged manner. But I also believe that it is a rational way to behave, and that a few professionals who wish always to be market neutral in their attitude and behavior will do so. 2. As previously stated, I see a logical risk-reducing strategy that involves shorting the futures contract. I see no corresponding investment or hedging strategy whatsoever on the long side. By definition, therefore, a very maximum of 50% of the futures transactions can be entered into with the expectancy of risk reduction, and not less than 50%, the long side, must act in a risk-accentuating or gambling manner. 3. The actual balance would be enormously different from this maximum 50-50 division between risk reducers and risk accentuators. The propensity to gamble is always increased by a large prize versus a small entry fee, no matter how poor the true odds may be. That's why the Las Vegas casinos advertise big jackpots and why state lotteries headline big prizes. In securities, the unintelligent are seduced by the same approach in various ways, including a. penny stocks, which are manufactured by promoters precisely because they snare the gullible, creating dreams of enormous payoffs but with an actual group result of disaster, and b. low margin requirements through which financial experience attributable to a large investment is achieved by committing a relatively small stake. 4. We have had many earlier experiences in our history in which the high total commitment or low down payment phenomenon has led to trouble. The most familiar, of course, is the stock market boom in the late 20s, which was accompanied and accentuated by 10% margins. Saner heads subsequently decided that there was nothing pro-social about such thin-margined speculation, and that rather than aiding capital markets in the long run, it hurt them. Accordingly, margin regulations were introduced and made a permanent part of the investment scene. The ability to speculate in stock indexes with 10% down payments, of course, is simply a way around the margin requirements and will be immediately perceived as such by gamblers throughout the country. 5. Brokers, of course, favor new trading vehicles. Their enthusiasm tends to be in direct proportion to the amount of activity they expect. And the more the activity, the greater the cost to the public, and the greater the amount of money that will be left behind by them to be spread among the brokerage industry. As each contract dies, the only business involved is that the loser pays the winner. Since the casino, the futures market, and its supporting cast of brokers gets paid a toll each time one of these transactions takes place, you can be sure that it will have a great interest in providing very large numbers of losers and winners. But it must be remembered that for the players, it is the most clear sort of a negative-sum game. Losses and gains cancel out before expenses. After expenses, the net loss is substantial. In fact, unless such losses are quite substantial, the casino will terminate operations since the players' net losses compose the casino's sole source of revenue. This negative sum aspect is in direct contrast to common stock investment generally, which has been a very substantial positive sum game over the years, simply because the underlying companies, on balance, have earned substantial sums of money that eventually benefit their owners, the stockholders. 6. In my judgment, a very high percentage, probably at least 95% and more likely much higher, of the activity generated by these contracts will be strictly gambling in nature. You will have people wagering as to the short-term movements of the stock market and able to make fairly large wagers with fairly small sums. They will be encouraged to do so by brokers who will see rapid turnover of customers' capital, the best thing that can happen to a broker in terms of his immediate income. A great deal of money will be left behind by these 95% as the casino takes its bite from each transaction. 7. In the long run, gambling-dominated activities that are identified with traditional capital markets, and that leave a very high percentage of those exposed to the activity burned, are not going to be good for capital markets. Even though people participating in such gambling activity are not investors, and what they are buying really are not stocks, they will still feel that they have had a bad experience with the stock market. And after having been exposed to the worst face of capital markets, they understandably may, in the future, take a dim view of capital markets generally. Certainly that has been the experience after previous waves of speculation. You might ask if the brokerage industry is not wise enough to look after its own long-term interests. History shows brokers to be myopic. Witness the late 60s. They often have been happiest when behavior was at its silliest. And many brokers are far more concerned with how much they gross this month than whether their clients, or for that matter, the securities industry, prosper in the long run. We do not need more people gambling in non-essential instruments identified with the stock market in this country, nor brokers who encourage them to do so. What we need are investors and advisors who look at the long-term prospects for an enterprise and invest accordingly. We need the intelligent commitment of investment capital, not leveraged market wagers. The propensity to operate in the intelligent, pro-social sector of capital markets is deterred, not enhanced, by an active and exciting casino operating in somewhat the same arena, utilizing somewhat similar language, and serviced by the same workforce. In addition, low-margined activity in stock equivalents is inconsistent with expressed public policy as embodied in margin requirements. Although index futures have slight benefits to the investment professional wishing to hedge out the market, the net effect of high-volume futures markets and stock indexes is likely to be overwhelmingly detrimental to the securities buying public and, therefore, in the long run, to capital markets generally.
The Inside Story of Warren Buffett, April 11, 1988, by Carol Loomis. This story has a little more history than most. In the first 20 years after I became a friend of Warren Buffett's, and soon after a Berkshire Hathaway stockholder, and still later, the pro bono editor of his annual letter to stockholders, I wrote no more than a few paragraphs about him in Fortune. True, as his reputation grew exponentially, I suggested some Buffett stories, the Grinnell and Whoops articles, for example. But other members of the magazine's staff wrote them, and that suited me fine. In early 1988, however, Fortune's managing editor, Marshall Loeb, called me into his office and gave me a fish or cut bait choice. He said it was time we did a full profile about Buffett. "You can write it," he said to me, knowing that I knew Warren well, "or I'll assign someone else to do it." My decision, made after a hard day's thought, was to write the story myself. I knew that was the right choice for the readers of Fortune. who would get a true inside story from me because I understood Buffett's world so well. But naturally, they needed to know also that I was a friend of Buffett's, a shareholder of Berkshire, and editor of his annual letter. All of those facts were reported in the article, and have since become regulars in other pieces I have written about Buffett. Marshall's timing for the profile was excellent. My article told an important story that had up until then stayed below the radar. How Buffett, the extraordinary investor, had also come to be Buffett, the extraordinary businessman and manager. At his side, playing a critical advisory role, was his brilliant friend Charlie Munger. To an extent recognized by outsiders hardly at all, the two had put Berkshire on the path to becoming a very big and successful business. C.L. Warren Buffett, chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, calls the conglomerate his canvas, and shortly, when its annual report comes out, the world will learn precisely what kind of picture this legendary investor painted in the tumultuous year of 1987. A preview? As a work of art, the year was not a minor Buffett. Berkshire, whose shareholders I wish to say quickly and happily have long included me, chalked up a $464 million gain in net worth, an advance of no less than 19.5%. That is somewhat below the 23.1% annual average that Buffett has recorded since taking over the company 23 years ago. But in a year in which many professional investors had their heads handed to them, this latest example of Buffett brushwork has to rank as one more masterpiece. The annual report, which readers always comb for Buffett's once-a-year revelations about what he has been doing in the securities markets, will carry two special pieces of news. First, Buffett, who bought $700 million of Salomon Inc. redeemable convertible preferred stock for Berkshire just before the October crash, makes it clear in his chairman's letter that he is solidly behind the investment bank's chairman, John Gutfreund. That should put an end to the persistent rumors about divisions between the two men. Second, Buffett reveals that Berkshire began buying short-term Texaco bonds last year after the company went into bankruptcy, at a point when many other investors were bailing out of the bonds. At year-end, Berkshire had an unrealized profit in the Texaco securities. But both that holding and the Salomon preferred, which Buffett figures to have been worth about $685 million at year-end, are carried at cost on Berkshire's books and were non-events as far as the company's 1987 record is concerned. Behind that record, behind Buffett, in fact, is a double-barreled story, in which all the words that have been written about him has usually been told as a single bore only. Most of the business world knows about Warren Buffett, the investor, the Wizard of Omaha, the stock-picking genius who turned $9,800, most of it saved from paper routes, into a personal net worth that is today more than $1.6 billion. The man whose superlative, long-running investment performance has become ever more difficult for the efficient market camp to explain away as luck. That Buffett was certainly abroad in the land in 1987. Having said for more than 2 years that he could not find reasonably priced stocks to buy for Berkshire, Buffett came into October 19 wearing heavy armor, owning almost no common equities besides those of 3 companies that he thinks of as permanent parts of Berkshire's portfolio. All 3, though they fell substantially in the crash, were standouts for the entire year. Geico, the auto insurance company, was up by 12%, Washington Post by 20%, Capital Cities ABC by 29%. Not bad for Buffett the investor. But the other craftsman at work in Berkshire is Buffett the businessman, a buyer and manager of companies, and a fellow whose skill is not understood widely at all. In effect, this guy grinds out the yardage, while Buffett the investor throws bombs. In 1987, the Berkshire offense was nicely balanced. The investor produced $249 million after allowances for taxes in realized and unrealized gains. The businessman generated $215 million in after-tax operating earnings from Berkshire's stable of businesses, for that total of $464 million. The operating earnings were more than the net income of Dow Jones or Pillsbury or Corning Glassworks. The vehicle through which all this got done, Berkshire, had a stock price of around $12 in 1965 when Buffett took control. It rose to a high of $4,200 in 1987 and was recently about $3,100. Buffett, a witty, straightforward man of 57, owns 42% of the company. His wife, Susan, 55, another 3%. Berkshire had more than $2 billion in revenues in 1987. Will probably rank around 30th in Fortune's annual list of the largest diversified services companies and is powerfully strange in its makeup. At Berkshire's heart is a large property and casualty insurance operation composed of several unfamous companies, such as National Indemnity, which generates float that Buffett invests. Beyond insurance, Berkshire owns a set of sizable businesses that Buffett bought one by one and that he calls his Sainted Seven. They are the Buffalo News, Feckheimer Brothers, a Cincinnati manufacturer and distributor of uniforms, the Nebraska Furniture Mart, an Omaha retailer that sells more home furnishings than any other store in the country, See's Candies, the dominant producer and retailer of candy in California, and 3 operations that Buffett took into the fold when Berkshire bought Scott and Fetzer of Cleveland in 1986. World Book, Kirby Vacuum Cleaners, and a diversified manufacturing operation that makes industrial products such as compressors and burners. A motley crew, yes. But in his 1987 annual report, Buffett the businessman comes out of the closet to point out just how good these enterprises and their managers are. Had the Sainted Seven operated as a single business in 1987, he says, they would have employed $175 million in equity capital, paid only a net $2 million in interest, and earned, after taxes, $100 million. That's a return on equity of 57%. And it is exceptional. As Buffett says, you'll seldom see such a percentage anywhere, let alone at large diversified companies with nominal leverage. A business school professor, trying gamely a few years ago to reconcile the efficient market hypothesis with Buffett's success at investing, called him a 5 sigma event, a statistical aberration so rare it practically never happens. In the buying and managing of whole companies, he may well be a phenomenon equally uncommon. He brings to buying the same acuity and discipline he brings to investing. As a manager, he disregards form and convention and sticks to business principles that he calls simple, old, and few. The Berkshire companies, for example, never lose sight of what they're trying to do. Says Buffett, if we get on the main line, New York to Chicago, we don't get off at Altoona and take side trips. We also have a reverence for logic around here. But what we do is not beyond anybody else's competence. I feel the same way about managing that I do about investing. It's just not necessary to do extraordinary things to get extraordinary results. My credentials for writing about both Buffetts, the investor and the businessman, are unusual. Besides having been a staff member of this magazine for more than 30 years, I have been a friend of Buffett's for more than 20. I do some editing of his annual report, which is why I know what it's going to say. And I am an admirer of Buffett's. In this article, because it has been written by a friend, you can expect 2 things: an inside look at how Warren Buffett operates, and something less than total objectivity. But here is an incontestable fact. Buffett brings an immense mental brilliance to everything he does. Michael Goldberg, 41, who runs Berkshire's insurance operations and occupies the office next to Buffett's in Omaha, thinks that he saw people as smart at the Bronx High School of Science, but they all went into math and physics. Buffett's intellectual power is totally focused on business, which he loves and knows incredible amounts about. Says Goldberg, he is constantly examining all that he hears. Is it consistent and plausible? Is it wrong? He has a model in his head of the whole world. The computer there compares every new fact with all that he's ever experienced and knows about, and says, what does this mean for us? For Berkshire, that is. Buffett owns a few stocks personally, but spends little time thinking about them. He says, my ego is wrapped up with Berkshire, no question about that. Meeting him, most people would see little evidence of ego at all. Buffett is down to earth, ordinary looking in a pleasant, solid Midwestern way. As a private eye, for example, he could blend into any crowd. And in matters of dress, not snappy. He likes McDonald's and cherry Cokes, and dislikes large parties and small talk. But in the right setting, he can be highly gregarious and even a ham. This winter, at a Cap Cities management meeting, he donned a Salvation Army uniform, tooted away on a horn, and serenaded the company's chairman, Thomas Murphy, by singing, What a Friend I Have in Murphy, featuring lyrics he had written. Sometimes, and particularly on intellectual subjects, Buffett talks with great intensity and speed, trying to keep up with the gyrator in his mind. When he was young, he was terrified of public speaking. So he forced himself to take a Dale Carnegie course, filled, he says, with other people equally pitiful. Today he gives speeches with ease, drawing them entirely from an outline in his head, no written speech, no notes, and lacing them with an inexhaustible supply of quips, examples, and analogies, for which a professional writer would kill. In his work, Buffett has not let the complexities of his thinking prevent him from forming a very simple view of life. The key point about the two Buffetts, the investor and the businessman, is that they look at the ownership of businesses in exactly the same way. The investor sees the chance to buy portions of a business in the stock market at a price below intrinsic value, that is, below what a rational buyer would pay to own the entire establishment. The manager sees the chance to buy the whole business at no more than that intrinsic value. The kind of merchandise that Buffett wants is simply described also: good businesses. To him, that essentially means operations with strong franchises, above-average returns on equity, a relatively small need for capital investment, and the capacity, therefore, to throw off cash. That list may sound like motherhood and apple pie, but finding and buying such businesses isn't easy. Buffett likens the hunt to bagging rare and fast-moving elephants. He has avoided straying from his strict criteria. The Sainted Seven all possess the characteristics of a good business. So do the companies in which Buffett owns stock, such as Geico, Washington Post, and Cap Cities. In his annual reports, Buffett regularly extols the managers of all these companies, most of whom rival him, if anyone can, in their conviction that working is fun. He devoutly wishes to keep them fanatics. Wonderful businesses run by wonderful people is his description of the scene he wants to look down on as a chief executive. But he believes that over the years, his largest mistakes in investing have been the failure to buy certain good business stocks just because he couldn't stomach the quality of management. I'd have been better off trusting the businesses, he says. So in the stocks he has sometimes held, though not in the businesses he owns directly, he has on occasion gritted his teeth and tolerated a fair amount of management inanity. A few years ago, when he owned many more stocks than now, he complained to a friend about the absurdities of an annual report he had just read, describing the content as misleading and self-serving of management and enough to make you throw up. The friend said, "And yet you're in the stock." "Yes," was his answer. "I want to be in businesses so good that even a dummy can make money." Naturally, good businesses do not come cheap, particularly not today when the whole world has caught on to their attributes. But Buffett has been constantly shrewd as a buyer. He simply will not overpay, and patient in waiting for opportunities. He regularly puts an ad in his annual report explaining what kind of businesses he'd like to buy. For the right business and the right people, we can provide a good home, he says. Some folks of the right sort, by the name of Heldman, read that ad and brought him their uniform business, Feckheimer, in 1986. The business had only about $6 million in profits, which is an operation smaller than Buffett thinks ideal. But the Heldmans seemed so completely the kind of managers he looks for: likable, talented, honest, and goal-driven, is his description. That he made the acquisition and is delighted he did. In buying at least one business, the Buffalo News, Buffett was particularly far-seeing. Both the Washington Post Company and Chicago's Tribune Company turned it down when it came up for sale in 1977, perhaps discouraged because it was an evening paper, a dwindling breed. The News was also a 6-day publisher with no Sunday edition and revenue stream, competing against a 7-day publisher, the Courier Express. But the News was the stronger of the two during the week, and Buffett concluded the paper had the makings to do well if it could establish a Sunday edition. Buying the paper for $32.5 million, he immediately started to publish on Sunday. The News's special introductory offers to subscribers and advertisers prompted the Courier Express to bring an antitrust suit, which he defeated. Both papers went for years, losing money, and then, in 1982, the Courier Express gave up and closed down. Last year, the News, as a flourishing monopoly paper, made $39 million in pre-tax operating profits and certainly did not do it by stinting on editorial copy. The paper delivers 1 page of news for every page of advertising, a proportion not matched by any other prosperous newspaper of its size or larger. Because Buffett loves journalism, he says that if he had not been an investor, he might well have picked journalism as a career. The News is probably his favorite property. The oddity of Buffett's intense focus on good business is that he came late to that philosophy after a couple of decades of mucking around and making prodigious amounts of money anyway. As a kid in Omaha, he was precocious and fascinated by anything having to do with numbers and money. His father, Howard Buffett, a stockbroker whom the son adored, affectionately called him Fireball. He virtually memorized a library book, 1,000 Ways to Make $1,000, fantasizing in particular about penny-weighing machines. He pictured himself starting with a single machine, pyramiding his take into thousands more, and turning himself into the world's youngest millionaire. In Presbyterian Church, he calculated the lifespans of the composers of hymns, investigating whether their religious calling had rewarded them with extra years of life. His conclusion? No. At age 11, he and a friend moved into more secular pursuits, putting out a horse racing handicapping sheet under the name Stable Boy Selections. Through it all, he thought about stocks. He got his first books on the market when he was 8, bought his first stock, Cities Services Preferred, at 11, and went on to experiment with all manner of trading methodologies. He was a teenager stock chartist for a while, and later a market timer. His base from 1943 on was Washington, where his family moved upon Howard Buffett's election to Congress. Deeply homesick for Omaha, young Warren once ran away from home and also got disastrous grades for a while in junior high, even in the math at which he was naturally gifted. Only when his father threatened to make Warren give up his lucrative and much-loved paper routes did his grades improve. Graduating from high school at 16, Buffett went through 2 years at the University of Pennsylvania and then transferred to the University of Nebraska. There, in early 1950, while a senior, he read Benjamin Graham's newly published book, The Intelligent Investor. The book encouraged the reader to pay attention to the intrinsic value of companies and to invest with a margin of safety